So this evening, Parag Khanna will speak to the title, Move, How Mass Migration Will Reshape the World and What It Means for You. Parag is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveller and best-selling author. He is founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. And Parag's newest book is Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, which was preceded by The Future is Asian, Commerce, Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century. He's also author of several other books, including a trilogy of books on the future of the world order. His books have been translated into more than 20 languages. I'm only halfway through the introduction. He's a busy man. Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and bachelor's and master's degrees from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Born in India, Parag grew up in the United Arab Emirates, New York, and Germany. He's also an accomplished adventurer who has traveled to nearly 150 countries on all continents. Examples of his more lengthy journeys include driving from the Baltic Sea, through the Balkans and across Turkey and the Caucasus to the Caspian Sea, across the rugged terrain of Tibet and the Xinjiang provinces in Western China, and traveling 10,000 kilometers from London to Ulaanbaatar in the Mongolia Charity Rally. He has, just to work off some more energy, climbed numerous 20,000-foot peaks and trekked in the Alps, Himalayas, and Tian Shan mountain ranges. I feel breathless after that introduction. Hopefully he's got some breath left. Parag, please join us on the stage.
Thank you so much, Nigel, for that breathless introduction. It's such an honor to be back here in the Temple of Geography. I want to express my deep gratitude to you and to Joe Smith for inviting me. And indeed, I have very warm memories of about 5 years ago when Nicholas and Rita hosted me as well to lecture on connectography. But I also have a guilty conscience from that evening in this very intimate theater, because giddy as a schoolboy, I think I prepared something like 60 PowerPoint slides and left almost no time for the Q&A. So this time we have a disciplinary monitor to make sure that I keep things terse so that we can have a great conversation. And I'm also looking up there at the balcony of students who I hope will be drawn into this conversation for reasons that will quickly become apparent. So let me dive right in. When we talk about geography, it's a discipline like others, I suppose, that lends itself to certain axiomatic arcs, grand statements that are somewhat deterministic, if vaguely so. And none is more known than geography is destiny. It's coupled sometimes with demography is destiny. When I previously lectured here, it was about a book in whose punchline was connectivity is destiny. And Move is very much, or was intended as a sequel to that. And I wanted to answer the question, if we have built this globe-spanning, enveloping web of infrastructures, transportation, energy, and communications, what are we going to do with it? And who is the we? And so this is really a book about human geography, which I've touched upon in previous books, but I wanted to devote an entire enterprise to understanding the evolving human geography, the human condition over the coming 10, 20, and 30 years. So this evening, I'll be talking a lot about physical geography and climate change and the implications of that for the habitable spaces in the world. And I'll spend an equal amount of time on the demographics of the future. So it is the where and it is the who. And bringing those together is, in a nutshell, oversimplified, what human geography is all about. Now, I've used the word geography in the singular, but what I also wanted to do in this project is to actually deconstruct and reconstruct geography in the plural, geographies. And this is something that I think is still lacking certainly in the public consciousness, and unfortunately in geographical education as well. At a minimum, I believe there are 4 essential layers of geography that need to be understood in a synthetic way, and we tend to sort of divorce them from each other a bit too much. The first and most obvious and least debatable is, of course, natural geography. We tend to take maps like this for granted. We don't debate the color scheme. We know that brown represents deserts, green for forests, blue for oceans, white for ice, and so forth. We are increasingly appreciating the internal dynamism of our natural geography as a result of accelerated climate change. We appreciate that we actually have to update maps like this all the time. When glaciers melt, there's less white. When sea levels rise, there's more blue. Desertification occurs, there's less green, more brown, and so forth. What we tend to not appreciate as much, even though we're at least waking up to this, is the relationship between this and the other three layers of geography which it affects. And the second layer being political geography. Now, this is the map that hangs in pretty much every classroom and office around the world. And I consider it something of it's a scandal, actually, I think, that we raise our children from birth through their professional lives to believe that this is the natural division of the world, or that the world, by its very nature, is divided, because why would they think differently? From the time they're 4 years old, they go into classrooms and they see these arbitrary lines. And that's the greatest irony of all, because of all the layers of maps that I could show you and that others could, what has proven to be more arbitrary than the political map? The lines are changing all the time. Some of them have their original form and shape and location due to natural features, but politics itself is the most malleable force, if you will, shaping this geography. And the simplest evidence, of course, is the number of countries in the world, which is nearly quadrupled since the United Nations was founded in 1945. So there's nothing given about this map, even though it is treated in our day-to-day lives as immutable. And in fact, to say nothing of the other layers of geography that I'll talk about in a minute, natural geography is going to have a profound impact on political geography, the livability, habitability, survivability of entire states and nations. The third layer is what I devoted connectography to, which is functional geography, the built world. Again, no one has this map hanging in their homes or offices, but you should. Because after all, this is the world as we want it to be. We don't accidentally spend $3 trillion a year building highways, railways, ports, airports, undersea internet cables, high-speed railways. We do it by our own volition. And so this is the effort that we make collectively as a species to overcome the constraints of natural geography and to transcend political geography. It's the world we want, but we don't even visualize it as much. And yet, again, it is just one layer of geography. It alone also cannot explain the world, in the same way that natural geography alone can't explain everything. Geography alone is not destiny, and demographics alone can't. But that is the fourth layer. And this, again, is a map that doesn't hang in any classrooms. But you would think that we would be more curious about where we are, the geography of us. I think it's material. I think it's interesting. And yet, if we were to ask, yes, everyone knows there's a lot of people in China, and there's a lot of people in India. But again, we often take human geography for granted in the sense that this is where people are, and this is where they've been. And yes, there's a lot more of them, but they're more or less going to stay that way. But of course, as politics interacts with climate change, interacts with infrastructure, interacts with this, I believe this map of human geography is going to be mixed up considerably. And that is the point of departure, in a way, for this investigation. But it's not, there are many factors, really, that over the grand arc of the last 100,000 years, since humankind wandered out of Africa and began settling the continents, that have driven human migration. In the 20th century in particular, which is the period during which the world population quadrupled and about which we have the best data, we can somewhat generalize as to the kind of primary forces, push and pull factors that have led to the largest volumes of human mobility. Demographic imbalances have been one. So labor shortages in economies, particularly in the OECD world, which are persistent and becoming even more acute today. I'll come back to that. Political upheavals, obviously, international conflicts, civil wars, genocides, and so forth. Economic dislocation owing to financial crises, deindustrialization, but even technological progress, like the internet and Zoom and remote work and so forth, allowing people to work from home and be wherever they want to be. And of course now climate change, which you could obviously rightly point out is the original driver of the geography of human settlement. And we've taken for granted that we live mostly in stable latitudes, as we have since the retreat of the last ice age more than 10,000 years ago. But with that changing, that becomes an old or sort of revived force that is a driver of mobility. So you have demographic imbalances, political upheaval, economic dislocation, technological disruption, climate change, 5 driving forces that are not to be treated or understood in isolation, of course, but that in a combined way, often interacting with each other, and multiplied, as I say here in this very crude formula, by the existence of connectivity will lead to accelerated or amplified mobility around the world in the decades ahead. So let's go back to our human geography and isolate this newest force of climate in particular, because I think we're familiar with the patterns of migration in history and what's driven them, but we're just waking up in a way to the profound reality and the accelerated conditions that climate change is bringing about. So if you need to squint, do so now, because I want you to focus on the animation for the next few seconds. Again, this is the present distribution of the world population, 8 billion pixels on this map. And this is the overlay of the IPCC and NOAA forecasts around the what's called the suitability change for human habitation of the planet in the coming decades as temperatures rise 1, 2, 3, perhaps even higher degrees above the 1990 baseline used by the IPCC. So red does not mean unlivable, though of course the Sahara Desert is already unlivable. But it means less suitable over time to human habitation because of things like the wet bulb effect and so forth, and obviously the sort of disappearance of sources of water and so forth. Green indicates places that are becoming more livable, actually, over time. Now, I'll submit another superlative to you. I can think of no more perverse moral condition or challenge in the world today, and no more existential a risk that we face to humanity than this map. Because if you go back to the demographics, to the human geography from the previous map, you will note that the majority of the world population lives in places today that are becoming red. And as you may very well know, Britain being no exception, that the countries of the northern hemisphere are by and large depopulating, right? That actually have declining populations, if not for migration. So I can, again, think of no more perverse statement than the fact that the elderly populations of the world in depopulating societies are inhabiting the terrain that remains or is becoming more livable over time, and the world's, particularly youth, but even the majority of the population as a whole, and particularly the world's young people, are mostly trapped in places that are becoming red. That is today's world, it's tomorrow's world, and the day after tomorrow's world, unless we do something about it. But of course, in our present political conditions and institutional arrangements, there isn't really a we that fixes this. You don't turn to the United Nations. If you follow the IPCC, in the COP26 process, you know very well that that is not going to solve this dilemma either. There isn't a roadmap, There isn't a supranational force. There isn't a common ethical, moral, or diplomatic framework to resolve this. That doesn't make it any less our collective existential challenge. It makes it even more a challenge than it otherwise would be, because we can't really turn to any one force to solve this. This is a collective enterprise, a collective point of departure that I think we all need to face. So I mentioned the sort of 5 driving forces, and historically and crudely, I've sort of summarized that the drivers of migration over the centuries generally fall into the political or economic buckets. And if you go back over the past several hundred years and you play forward and you look century by century at the volume of migrations internationally or across the oceans and the drivers of those, you'd find roughly there's been a split between political and economic and indeed, of course, colonial, which is some mix of the two, drivers of the mass resettlement of human populations. And the number of people who have been migrants has increased from the millions to the tens of millions, and in the 20th century to the hundreds of millions. So the decimal point has been moving to the right. Now, as you introduce climate as a variable again, and according to the International Organization of Migration, today in the stock of displaced peoples in the world, climate accounts for about 1/3 of them already in this century. But that doesn't mean that the political and the economic drivers of migration have gone away. The search for opportunity, regime failure in failed states, and the collapse of societies and so forth also coexist and, of course, relate to climate change. If we think about the example of Syria, Yemen, and so forth, there's a climate reality. So I seek not to actually disentangle economic, political, and climate forces, because that would be the exact opposite of what I was saying at the beginning, which is that these deeply interrelate to each other. So we have, again, I want to emphasize that all of the drivers of migration historically are not only present today, but are very much in overdrive. But whereas we have an international legal framework, not a good one, but we actually have one, going back to the 1951 Refugee Convention, for people who are displaced for political reasons, we do not have one for climate variables. And that is something that is right now, as we speak, being actively litigated case by case as climate refugees seek either permanent resettlement rights in certain countries or indeed are sent back. And I want to just give everyone a not so hypothetical. Right now, European countries, particularly continental European countries, are sending Syrian refugees and asylum seekers, people who were granted asylum, back to Syria, on the grounds that the state is stable-ish enough that, based on their own legal judgment, it is justified to send them back to their home country. Tell me how you apply that to a scenario where a country has run out of water and people have become climate refugees in your state. Do you just say, it's fine, you can go back? Of course not. You can't do that. But again, we have not evolved an international framework for that. So climate adaptation, of which I believe climate migration is going to be probably the most likely large-scale response, is something that is deeply, deeply neglected. In the COP26 process, a couple of data points came out. One is that more than 90% of our climate-related spending is around mitigation. And mitigation is very important. It could be, nothing could be more important to some degree in terms of decarbonizing industries, reducing emissions, greening supply chains, and all of those things. Of course, we must do that, and we should spend even more than we already do on those things, a lot more. But that leaves about less than 10% of today's capital allocation to climate issues to adaptation, which is something that we need to do every single day, all the time, for the millions and billions of people who are affected, and we don't spend nearly enough on that. So yes, we're investing in a better tomorrow, but we're not investing in helping people adapt to today and potentially to tomorrow. And what I do in some of my writing and reportage in this book is kind of emphasize the adaptation angle. What does it mean? Obviously, it's technological investments in retrofitting certain habitats. It's also about, inevitably, the mass relocation of people. And if I were to ask you, what is the one single way you can improve the human condition for a person or populations that are vulnerable to any of the aforementioned risks or challenges in their geography, whether it is the lack of political and civic rights, or whether it is the dearth of environmental ecosystems and resources to survive, you might come up with a long list of things around, oh, we need to give more aid, and we need to deliver more of these services, and we need to reform their government. Well, here's an idea. They could move, right, tomorrow. Again, physically it's possible. Logistically it's possible. We do have all this connectivity, after all, right? But that's the one thing you will never hear at COP26. The one thing you will never hear when sovereign governments get together is, oh yes, let's allow the free movement of people. Let's have a mass resettlement and reorganization collectively of our entire human geography of 8 billion people. Sure. You will never hear climate migration at the top of the agenda in one of these summits where sovereign governments get together. In fact, and I'll put on my sort of political theory, political science hat on for a moment. I did, after all, study this at the LSE in this very city. When all is said and done, and states have either voluntarily or involuntarily sacrificed or lost various artifacts of sovereignty, control over their currencies, inability to prevent pathogens and cyber attacks and so forth across their borders, what is the one single thing that will remain of sovereignty, even for the weakest states when all else is lost? It's their ability to at least attempt to police and control their borders against the movement of human beings. That's it. That's what sovereignty means in many ways, the most fundamental, at its non-theoretical level, in its practical application in day-to-day life when you've lost all else. That. So I just don't think that's going to be top of mind at any UN summit anytime soon. So I come back to the point that there is no roadmap, no solution off the shelf for us here. So I'll get into some of the terminologies and ideas that I have around how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess. But let me a couple more slides on the geography here in terms of adapting or looking at the specific zones on the planet today derived from that map, from that IPCC and other sources forecast around livable versus unlivable geographies. A few stand out that I have chapters on in the book, places like Canada and the Great Lakes region, Eastern Anatolia, a lot around Central Asia and Russia. Again, all the places that are sort of green or teal here on this map. Let me go around the world a little bit and just make a couple of points about some of the principal areas and definitely some of the obscure ones as well. But North America. Now, in the last roughly 30 to 40 years, the most obvious thrusts in shifts, population shifts in the United States have been from north to south and from east to west, which is the exact opposite of what climate models are telling us about what is happening to North America in general and the United States in particular. What you see elevated here in the central section around the Great Lakes and the US-Canada border is the adaptation of this notion of the climate niche to this particular continent. And it's funny because the states like Michigan, Illinois, Minnesota are still losing people right now. They're actually losing districts and seats in Congress because their populations are shrinking. But these are actually what are known as the climate havens in America, but the market hasn't priced this in. The jobs haven't come back to those places. These are places that are still suffering from deindustrialization, from the effects of globalization and outsourcing and so forth. But as that climate niche shifts, eventually, I think, people are going to change direction, if you will, in a long, meandering, circuitous kind of arc. And you can see the efforts in the policy environment in America around trying to get people to think differently about where they buy, where they spend. So you can no longer get flood insurance in certain places. If your home has been destroyed in a coastal area on the Atlantic coast or the Gulf Coast, you'll no longer get the sort of a grant to rebuild your home. Basically, the government is asserting eminent domain in those geographies and saying, here's $225,000, but you cannot come back and live here ever again. Just go somewhere else, go somewhere livable. And climate modeling is fortunately being used now to inform the insurance sector and the real estate sector and others so that you can have these nudging effects in terms of reorganizing the population. In the best case scenario, this happens in a sensible way. The way infrastructure spending is often done in democratic countries, certainly in America, is that, of course, the market drives where people want to go. They want to live in sunny places and low-tax places. So the big winners from the pandemic have been Texas and Florida because they have no tax. Internet's good enough. People move there. Elon Musk says he's moving to Texas. The mayor of Miami says, come and trade your Bitcoin here. And so those places get more populated. But what we need to start doing in any society is to look at the climate models first, then think about how to nudge people to live in climate-resilient places, and then spend the money on the infrastructure, right? That's the sequencing that we need to be following: climate, migration, infrastructure. You shouldn't be making 50-year infrastructure investments on places that are not going to be around or livable in the next 10 or 20 years, right? But that's the way the market would dictate we do things. But from a policy standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, from a utilitarian standpoint, we should be doing things in this sequence. So I said there are climate oases, climate havens, in different parts of the world, and I highlight here, just kind of again stylistically, some of the places that I suppose if you're a property investor, go ahead, take a photo right now and buy wherever there's a star. That happens to include, as you can see, a pretty nice chunk of the British Isles. You're actually taking photographs, great. I'll take a commission on a. What I've tried to do is to assess places, obviously not only by the happenstance of geography and whether or not they will be relatively blessed or less cursed by climate change and volatility, but obviously other factors as well that relate to their political sort of contours and desirability, the economics, whether or not there's actual jobs there, the cultural factors as well in terms of their willingness to absorb migrants. But you cannot hold any of these things as static. And that has been some of the most interesting parts of the research, is to kind of go country by country and to look at how their own politics is changing in light of climate change and whether it has altered the national psychology and the politics of migration in terms of whether these places are going to be more migrant friendly. So now I want to transition to the demographics a bit and talk about the who. We've talked a bit about the where. We can certainly come back to any point on the map and have a lively discussion about the livability, suitability, and adaptation of that place to climate change or to new populations. That's the real political heart of the story that still has to be written. But let's talk about the who is going to be doing the moving, and this is where the generational change comes in. Over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've settled into fairly stable, mostly intra-regional patterns of migration in terms of the flow and the resulting stock of migrants. So you can see that some of the largest zones of internal regional or intra-regional migration have been people of the former Soviet republics, Africans within Africa, South Americans either within South America or making their way northward into North America, Europeans within Europe, and so forth. Certainly South Asian populations to the Gulf countries. But again, this is almost a pre-climate map, right? The patterns that we've grown accustomed to are not necessarily a good guide to the future. And some of the new vectors that I talk about in the book are ones that are quite novel in human history in terms of South Asian populations moving way north into Central Asia and Asians migrating westward into Europe. But we don't know what direction this is going to take. Again, we don't know the outcome of the story. So I structured the argument really around 4 scenarios. 4 scenarios for what might happen in the future. Now, a very important note about scenario planning. Scenarios, in order to be plausible, have to already be rooted in some present reality. You can already see that each of these 4 scenarios exists today. They all coexist right now, simultaneously. Often in the same region of the world, but most certainly across the world. So the question that I pose is, what direction is the world going? But the correct answer is all of them. All of these are happening and will happen. The only question is where, and how do regions at that scale in particular adapt and choose what outcome is more likely. Now, as you read through these, you'll see that 3 of the 4 scenarios are not particularly happy, right? I'm often accused of being an optimist, and I don't know why, because this is not, as it's presently articulated, is not a very happy story. Regional fortresses would be most analogous to the present, right? North America, Europe, Northeast Asian countries haven't exactly flung the doors open to migrants. To the extent that investments are being made in adapting to climate change, it's self-interested and in their own geography, with some support being given for the adaptation efforts of other regions, mostly in the hopes of stemming migration rather than encouraging it. And again, these scenarios are built along the axes of migration and sustainability. Much of the world finds itself in some combination of these lower 2 scenarios, the New Middle Ages, barbarians at the gate. One is describing more the local conditions of the potential for social, societal breakdown as a result of climate scenarios. And again, the concomitant or resulting political breakdown of political order and so forth. And the barbarians at the gate dimension also brings in a bit, they both really could, the sort of not only the feudalism, but also the geopolitical competition, land grabs, water wars, whatever the case may be. And again, we already see that today in the Upper Nile, Mekong, and other key zones of the world. So only one scenario, Northern Lights, could you describe or characterize as being positive. And that's the one in which we collectively sort of bootstrap, have a vision for how we would redistribute, recirculate the mobile, those who can move and should be enabled to move, to relocate, to habitable geographies. But of course, in order to avoid the tragedy of the commons, because we're obviously not so great at managing the ecosystems in which we presently reside, but to relocate populations in a sustainable way and to invest in the kinds of infrastructures and technologies, almost all of which are present today, by the way, to have a far lower footprint in terms of environmental externalities, CO2 emissions, and so forth, than we presently do. So it is possible to do a Northern Light scenario. And again, as I said, the conditions are present today, and each scenario has a sort of root in reality. And if you think about what state best exemplifies the Northern Light scenario, it would be Canada, right? Canada is, pound for pound, the most generous migration destination country in the world. It increases its population very consciously by 1%, 1.5% every single year. That amounts to more than 400,000 new migrants. But of course, every year they have more people, but they're going to stick to that 1+%. So they're going to be taking more and more people every single year. It's become the top preferred destination in many rankings and surveys among professionals and students and so forth. So there is sort of heaven on earth, you might call it. Not many people describe Canada as heaven. Maybe I'll get honorary citizenship now that I've said that. But it is possible to have a country absorb very large numbers of migrants and not tear itself apart in doing so. Because indeed, as you probably know, there is a wide national consensus around immigration to Canada. They have citizenship ceremonies in their hockey stadiums and so forth. So Donald Trump's America, Canada is not. Let's dig in. I don't want to go on too long this evening. I see the countdown timer, by the way, has turned red. But let me wrap up with a few points on the who we're talking about here, because this is a really unique moment in, you could say in human history, certainly in anyone's recollection, because we've all grown up in the 20th or 21st century. Certainly in the 20th century, the world population quadrupled between 1920 and 1980, 1990-ish, right? So we more or less all recall a world in which the world population was growing, but what we're reaching now is what I call peak humanity, and this is the demographic point of departure of the book. If 20 years ago, many people still believe that the world population could reach 14 billion people, 15 billion people, and we'd find ourselves in a Malthusian crisis. But no such thing is going to happen. In fact, it's because of the Club of Rome report in the 1960s and the impact that it had and the deployment of population control policies by the US government and the United Nations and many other forces like urbanization and female empowerment and contraception and literacy and so forth, that the world population actually, fertility peaked in the 70s, roughly, and has been declining ever since. And the result of that is today's leveling off or plateau of the world population. So there's a rapid decline scenario and a gradual decline scenario, but actually, believe it or not, pray everyone in this room will live to see that day when you know how in the newspaper every 10, 15 years, there's a headline, the world population reaches 6 billion, 7 billion, 8 billion. Well, in the next 10 years or so, the headline is actually going to read, world population reaches its peak. That's it. Begins to decline from here. And none of us ever thought that was going to happen, but it effectively is already here. It's really in certain places like Africa and South Asia where you don't yet have peak humanity within those geographies. But the total human population, turns out, is going to be a very manageable number because it's not much larger than it is right now. I don't even think that we'll reach 9 or 9.5 billion people, which is still lower than the Gates Foundation and University of Washington estimates. Their most recent projection from 2019, note it's a very important year because it was before the pandemic, was 11 billion, but they didn't account for the baby bust, right? And the baby bust, not only of the financial crisis of 2008, but the baby bust of COVID has been substantially more severe than the GFC baby bust. And as a result, we can pretty much already forecast that Generation Alpha, who are today's sort of toddlers and not yet born until the year 2025, will still be producing Generation Alpha, is actually going to be smaller than Generation Z. So Generation Z, today's tweens-ish, or teens, are the largest generational stock of humans that our species has ever produced, about 1.9 or so billion. And Generation Alpha will probably be smaller, and it'll probably get smaller and smaller. Why? Well, as you probably know, between the economic insecurity that was sort of part and parcel of the financial crisis, and now the intervening climate consciousness and the COVID baby bust and everything else, young people don't want to have children. Our children don't want to have children, right? The children are, if they have children, may have one child, which is still well below total replacement levels. So as a result, a couple of things. One, we're reaching peak humanity, but something that can only be explained in sort of sci-fi terms is happening, which is that the present is the future. So the statement the present is the future doesn't seem to make any sense, but it does in demographics, because if our children don't have children, but our children are the largest generation in the world today, they'll also be the largest generation tomorrow, because there isn't one coming after them. So literally the present is the future. And that's what's happening. So pretty unique times that we're living in. And that makes youth particularly important. They become a geographical sort of swing factor, because where they go determines the demographic centers of the world. And what young people are more capable of doing than any previous generation is voting with their feet. Because we live in a very different world from the divided world of the Cold War. The world is much more open, much more connected, and young people, by virtue of not having children and more often than not owning property, are more mobile. So here you have the most mobile generation that the humankind has ever produced in a large number that isn't particularly attached to anything and is fleeing economic insecurity and climate change if only they can make it to where they want to go, in search of the ideal combination of latitude, altitude, and attitude. So this will change our politics in many ways. But I want to make one more point about the demographic, because we use the sort of pronoun we very often, when we're opining about certain issues. Who is we? And we very often when we're speaking, especially the demographic that I see in this room, including myself, tend to think of we as a two-parent, two-child, sort of suburban middle-income household. Well, that's not we on this planet. Not right now, and certainly not in the future. If you could characterize the median human being in the world, it wouldn't be that we. It would actually be a young person, a single person, childless person, financially struggling, living in a megacity. That's we. That's the central protagonist for me, because that person is literally most of the future human population today. So if you're out to figure out who will populate the future, and what are their characteristics, what are their values, what are their lifestyles, you need to be looking at the right we, and that's who I'm looking at. So I sort of just arrived at this in the course of my research, but I realized that without focusing on youth, you're almost telling the wrong story, because of course they are most of the future population of the world, and this is who they are. They're not like us, the young. And we have to accept this fact, these basic conditions. National loyalty is far less among them. Their cardinal virtues, or values, if you will, are connectivity, sustainability, and mobility, and the right to those things. This is actually where you have intergenerational legal warfare going on. In Australia, the youth are suing the pension fund for investing in hydrocarbon companies. Greta Thunberg, need I say more? Right? So survey after survey bears this out. Youth believe they have a right to connectivity, a right to a sustainable habitat, and a right to mobility around the world. And they'll fight for it. Now let me tie this together with a couple of other demographic points. Asia in particular is central here because, again, Asia represents already over half the entire world's population and most of the world's young people. So if Asia is most of the world's population today in a world with lower fertility and already has most of the world's young people, guess what? The future is Asian, which was my last book. I didn't mean it in this way to sort of continue the story, but that's how it turns out, funny enough. So I wound up looking a lot into diasporas, the Chinese diaspora, the Indian diaspora, Indian, Filipino, and so forth. And you add them all up and you see their growing propensity for outward migration, and you see the kind of brownification, as the Scottish Herald recently called it, of many parts of the world. And indeed, that's happening. So some of the scenarios that I devised and kind of fleshed out in the book involve, as I was briefly mentioning earlier, South Asians. And remember, the climate map. The most climate-stressed part of the planet, besides the Sahara Desert, is South Asia. And South Asia happens to be the single most populous region of the entire world. If you take just Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, you have 1.8 billion people, so a substantially larger population than, say, Greater China, with a median age that's much younger. So you have far more young people in a severely climate-stressed area who have a high propensity to leave and to want to leave their geography as climate conditions, and also, let's not forget, governance and other factors are questionable, if not downright undesirable. That's what's going on. So looking at where young people go will tell you a lot. Now, this may all seem like a very, sort of terrible story, but I want to issue a few caveats and reminders here that are a bit more optimistic, and say so right at the top of the slide. We're very good at mass migration. It's actually one of the great things about our global political evolution, if accidentally or passively, over the past centuries. We've proven to be not so great at maintaining international peace and stability. Not so great at having egalitarian societies domestically or internationally, and certainly very poor at managing the commons. But for the past couple of hundred years, what have we been, and now I use we in the traditional sense that we all normally mean it, we've been great at mass migration. Hundreds of millions, a grand total of easily billions of people over the past centuries collectively have relocated across the world, many of them mostly peacefully. And the winning societies of the present right now are, of course, those that have been tolerant of migration and absorbing migrations. And we often forget that because sometimes when I present this thesis, people say, oh my goodness, mass migrations, this is something really new and unprecedented, and how are we going to cope? Well, how about we cope the way we've been coping for the last centuries by being open to it and absorbing it and being societies that focus on and practice assimilation and winning as a result and becoming more dynamic and innovative and productive and wealthy and so forth, all at the same time. How about we try that? And that's something that we don't often think about. So what are the sort of principal lessons here in my play on Lenin, though it may have been apocryphal? You may not be interested in war, he said, but war is interested in you. So you may not be interested in migration, but migration is interested in you. We have to accept that it is, of course, inevitable given not only climate but the other variables, and necessary given our own demographic realities today with our aging populations and high dependency ratios. View it as an opportunity, not just a challenge, because it has been an opportunity that we have seized in our societies. Remember that collecting people is collecting power, and this is where voting with the feet comes in, because you don't want to be a depopulating country right now that is not giving birth to a vibrant next generation. You don't want to be in the situation of a Russia or a Bulgaria, right? So in a world that's demographically plateaued, you actually need to compete for young people. I could actually reduce the entire message of the book to this. Winning societies are those that are attracting young people, and failing societies are those that are losing young people. And that's it. That's what it comes down to. You decide what side of the equation you want to be on. It is literally yours to decide. There are emerging legal protocols and diplomatic arrangements that are encouraging countries to bring in the right composition of skilled and semi-skilled labor that they need for different sectors of the economy. So depoliticize migration and focus on those segments and populations that you actually do in fact need. Need I utter the words truck drivers in this country, among many other things. The final message really is a bit philosophical, but it really goes back to the first set of maps and the heart of what I try to do and to encourage. And I call it, technocrat that I am, programmable geography. What if we could, how do we overcome this conundrum of this great mismatch between the geography of resources, the geography of people, geography of borders, and the geography of infrastructure and economic activity? The organic approach does not exactly unfold at the timeline within the time frame that we need. And I think that we have to approach the world as a patchwork of resources, of people, of activities, and think about how we would better optimize it and start to undertake those kinds of proactive negotiations around what resources are useful to play what role in the global division of labor. And the term division of labor I use very consciously. It's a term borrowed from sociology, but applies very well when we think about this global context of geography. Again, what role does an individual play, a state play, its resources play in a global system? And how can we optimize its role and do so in a way that's win-win for that location? So I'm thinking about things like encouraging, underwriting, subsidizing countries to take on more migrants that can help their economy, for example, and all sorts of asset transfers and other kinds of things that can take place. If we think about the world as this overlay, and I hadn't yet shown this kind of overlay of geographies. I sort of left it to this final map, because this is how the world actually works, right? It's not just a map of natural geography, not just a map of political geography, not just a map of infrastructure, not just a map of people. To fully grasp the world's complexity, the feedback loops among these layers, one of the primary tasks is to simply at least map them all at the same time and understand how they affect each other in this stack, as it were. So the messier the map, as far as I'm concerned, the better the map. And this is the messiest map I have yet produced. So I'll wrap up just with my agenda. Is geography destiny? No. Is demography destiny? Not necessarily. It's what we make of it. And now is the time to make the most of it and to do better at it. And so the agenda that I would put forward really boils down to the first point there, which is that we have two choices in terms of sustaining the well-being of the species, of our species, over the next 10, 20, 30 years. You can do one of two things. You can move people to where the resources are, or you can move technologies to where the people are who need them. I would submit that if you're not doing one of those two things, you're not doing anything particularly useful or constructive if you set out to be humanitarian. You need to be doing one of those two things. Measure yourself against whether you are helping move people to resources or technologies to people. Do one of those two things. And yes, indeed, promote the idea of mobility as a human right. It is the best pathway to achieving all of the other rights that we hold dear and that we wish for other people, because it will take a long time to achieve those rights in other ways. And then thinking beyond sovereignty towards this stewardship, this programmable geography of managing the commons better, achieving that Northern Lights scenario, if you will. And if we do that, we will get to what I call in the book Civilization 3.0, which moves us beyond the era, the epochs in which we were nomadic and agricultural or sedentary and industrial, towards being mobile when we need to be, but sustainable wherever we are. And again, that is fully attainable with all of the technologies and resources, financial and technical, that we have at our disposal today. So make the most of our geography. That is my final message for this evening, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It is flashing here. Time is up, it says. It's very, very grim. Oftentimes when we're interviewing people, we say, yeah, but would you go on a transatlantic flight with them? And he's like, I've just found someone who would pass that interview. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
We have the opportunity for questions, which people can put onto their mobile device on Slido from home or from here, or can put your hands up and use the microphones, which should be up and about. So, questions. One here straight off. Or you could shout, and then I'll repeat it.
Professor David Sinclair of Harvard Medical School has just written a book called Lifespan, which argues that there is going to be an increase in human lifespan and what he calls healthy lifespan. We started at 30 years, we've moved to 50, 60, 80 years, 120 years. Within the next decade or so, advances in epigenetics, treatment of epigenetic decline, and personalized data-driven medical analysis and treatment will, at very low cost, push human lifespan to 120 years, which possibly adds 1 billion to human population every 20 years, which offsets the decline. So have you read this? Have you discussed this? Have you thought about this issue?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So that's a great question. I'm obviously familiar with the thesis, but if you look at, other than mobile phones, the spread and certain vaccinations, the spread of technology and the kinds of technologies that would enable this scenario to transpire tend to take much longer to spread around the world than technology optimists would have us believe. And I am a technology optimist, but in a particular area like this, it's going to take time. And it's obviously, that's the quote unquote best case scenario. Not everyone agrees that it is the best case scenario for us to extend our lifespans or to even maintain a high population. But you'd have to be looking at, again, which generation it applies to first and foremost. So starting with whom can you imagine this life extension occurring? Right now, by the way, let's remember there are countries that are regressing. Literally in the United States, the average life expectancy has gone down by a year or two. In some parts of America more. It's highly stratified and unequal. And yet it's particularly wealthy people in America who will be the chief beneficiaries of this technology given their biomedical innovation. And so you'll have, again, just inequalities. So I, at this point in time, can't imagine these interventions appearing tomorrow and applying to billions of people and applying, again, in that broad and egalitarian way such that it really benefits an entire cohort of people at the same time. And of course, none of the technological logic takes into account any of the other considerations around economic insecurity and climate change and so forth, which, again, may nominally increase or extend the lifespan of existing people so that artificially, in a way, if the world population is going to fall off a cliff, we're like, to use the analogy, which I think some of you probably know I'm about to, is the coyote in Roadrunner, right? So the coyote's kind of like spinning his feet, and he hasn't yet fallen, so we'll just spin our feet a little bit longer before we fall. But inevitably, the world population will decline, because unless you solve for the other disincentives for fertility and childbirth, eventually the population is going to decline anyway. So again, we have been so widely off the mark in our global demographic forecasting, right? Off by 5 billion between the projections of 20 years ago and where I am, right, with mine. 5 billion is the difference. So it could certainly be give or take 1 or 2, and certainly technology could account for a little bit of that. But unless you have significant expansion of fertility, it's headed in that direction along somewhere between those two curves that I painted. And again, I don't, if you look at the last 10 years in particular, where many countries have tried to promote, greater levels of childbirth and so on, it hasn't worked for an extended period of time anywhere. And where it has worked, it's worked in countries with extremely small populations that are already wealthy. But the fact is that right now, India's fertility is falling way. India just reached barely replacement fertility levels. It's happening across Africa as well. So, I think the technology itself is very promising. I don't think that it necessarily is going to move the needle in terms of our overall trajectory.
Thank you. So there's a couple of, there's lots of questions coming in from online. I'll try and bracket two together. So one is it too late for the 2050 people in global south countries currently threatened by climate impacts to have the chance to carry on living in the country they were born in under the flags that they were born under? And perhaps connected with that is, in the scenario of moving the technology to the people without the resources or the places without the resources, like sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, what current technologies do you think hold the most potential to make the biggest difference and those places more self-sustainable? Mm-hmm.
Good question. So, I actually, early on in the book, I begin with the premise that we're not really talking about moving 8 billion people per se, right? I mean, at least half the world's population is in places and in circumstances that would prohibit them to actually, be able to, or perhaps even want to relocate. It could be their age, they could be infirm, they could be just wedded to where they are, whatever the case may be, or obviously politically prevented from relocating or not need to relocate. But also this is where geography comes in. Because we don't live in a flat world without geographical boundaries. The fate of the people of South America is quite distinct from those of Africa versus Eurasia. And Eurasia, being the single largest megacontinent that itself is home to almost 3/5 of the world population, is going to have different population migratory dynamics than Africa or Latin American countries in South America. So we can't really generalize even about the South. So we have to say, okay, well, can the parts of South America and the parts of Africa that are going to remain livable absorb more people, and if so, how, and how many people are going to move from where to where within those continents? Those who can leave those continents, where will they be going? Will they be coming across the Mediterranean to Europe? Will they be traversing Central America to North America? Because, of course, the likelihood of Latin Americans winding up in Russia is not as high as them winding up in Mexico. Same thing goes for Africans, more likely to wind up in Italy than in Canada. So we have to respect and operate within these constraints of geography. So I focus a lot on Eurasian populations, because it's in any case most of the world's people, and certainly young Asians, as I mentioned before, and their trajectory. So let's presume for a minute that the target destinations of the question are people stuck, if you will, in India, or in certain African countries, or in South America. There, again, the challenges that they face are different from each other. Some may not face water shortages, others certainly will. Others are afflicted by frequent natural disasters, others aren't. And there it varies. Others face drought, some, others don't. So the technologies that are needed vary considerably. But of course, the cheapest interventions relate, of course, to either energy, food, or water, right? The three basic ingredients that we need for minimal, survival. So for water, a lot more could be done around solar-powered water desalination, for example. There's very little at scale in the world today. Also atmospheric water generation, which is still not cheap and requires a bit of electricity, so we could do solar-powered, direct air capture, things like this. So the water piece, can't be solved for everyone, of course. Many people are and will have to move, but I'm just giving some examples of technologies. Obviously, drought-resistant seeds, very basic technology, huge amount of capital innovation going into that, should be invested in and distributed far more actively so that you can have some agricultural predictability in places that are facing more seasonal volatility. So there's a lot of things like that. We could go through each and every problem, and there is, for each and every problem, some relatively affordable technological solution if we were to engage in it.
And we saw some of that in Tom Heap's lecture that went on just before Christmas. Question in the audience. I've got another one I must get to from someone online. Yes. Please.
Going back to your scenarios and about the Northern Lights one in particular, and without generalizing, what kinds of political discourses do you think will be needed or will happen to make that happen? Will it be economic? So talking about how you said that young societies will be needed to survive,
right.
Or will it more, would you think, in your opinion, be more humanitarian in certain places?
That's a great question.
So the question, just for those at home, is to do with making the Northern Lights scenario come true. What would have to happen politically, and what would drive that?
Right. So, as you said, your caveat was without generalizing. So it's difficult to, give a global answer on that because the discourse in Canada is open, is democratic, pluralistic, and progressive. In Russia, it's not. Right? Russia is not the Eurasian Canada. We could like it to be, and in its own best interest, it should move in that direction. And what's so interesting, and even, I finished the book actually a couple of years ago before the pandemic, but there have been surveys in Russia that I just read about in the last week that talk about how Russia is actually, again, to the extent that you can have these, they're not free and open surveys, but Russia is not a country where you can't survey the people, so you actually can. And they indicate that Russians across demographic, across age, sort of divides, are becoming more open to migration. It's really interesting. And it's not nearly where many European societies are, where younger Europeans, because they've already grown up in societies where there were lots of young people, or lots of foreigners have are accustomed to it, so they don't think of it as strange or awkward, the way older generations might. So Russians are starting to be like that, and I've quoted in many places, including in the book, Russian officials and bureaucrats, university administrators and project managers and mayors who say, we need more people here in Russia. We need to compete. We need Indian farmers. We need Chinese construction workers. We're taking all this Belt and Road money, but we don't have enough people to actually build all of this stuff, railways. And so we need to retrofit our old failing nuclear cities and turn them into dynamic new industrial hubs. We've become, Russia in 2021 was the world's largest wheat exporter. If I told you 10 years ago that Russia in 2021 would be the world's largest wheat exporter, you'd say I'm crazy. That's exactly what just happened. So there is change, and you see it on the ground. You don't hear it from the Kremlin, but you see it on the ground. And that's not a discourse driven by a humanitarian impulse, right? Far from it, right? That's not the way Russia operates, right? It's self-interested, but that doesn't mean that it can't be, passively or inadvertently benevolent. And that's kind of sort of what's happening. In Germany, it's about a recognition of the labor shortages that emerged from, having a very low fertility rate and needing, as the engine of Europe, needing more workers. The only country whose population and whose workforce has grown in Europe in the last several years. And it's obviously on the back of migration and being able to convert migrants from wherever they have arrived into real economic agents. And that makes them admirable as compared to countries that have a very haphazard or regressive immigration policy. I mean, no country that wants to grow in the future is thinking, yes, I should have Italy's immigration policy. Right? I mean, if you want to grow, you need to have Canada's or Germany's immigration policy. As I say, collecting people is collecting power. So I can't generalize about the discourse, and its characteristics, depends on the nature of the regime and so forth. But I can point to examples. Even Japan, let me just close with this. Japan is so interesting because no one would expect that perhaps one of the most insular societies in the world would open to migration the way they have. But right now, as we speak, there are 3 million non-Japanese people spread across all of the 40 prefectures of Japan. That's obviously never happened before. There have never been 3 million foreigners in Japan. And they keep on changing. For every time we say, they're Japanese, they'll never change, right? They're the Galapagos culture. Lo and behold, their parliament passes yet another law, as they literally did like 2 weeks ago, saying we're going to further relax immigration policy, give longer duration visas to workers, various skill levels, even allow permanent residency for people who have stayed over a certain period of time. And that means that a Nepali construction worker, of which there are about 75,000 in Japan, a Nepali construction worker can actually have permanent residency in Japan. Now, if I told you that 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, you'd laugh in my face. But that just happened, right? So I think that as the demographic realities hit, and they're going to hit harder and harder and harder, right? And countries realize they need a tax base. They need workers, they need caregivers, they need taxpayers, they need entrepreneurs, they need children in their schools, they need renters and homeowners. They make the pragmatic decision. And so I argue that supply and demand should be the main driver of immigration policy. Certainly in this country, it would have turned out a lot better in the last, say, 6 years if supply and demand were driving your immigration policy rather than populism. Just saying.
Question here.
Parag, thank you for an amazing lecture. And one question for you. I can't know the answer, but where do you live, and why have you chosen to live there to bring up your kids?
Okay. And that may dovetail with one of the questions here, which is talking about the more wealthy countries who are going to be confronting this climate crisis. Do they have any get-out-of-jail card?
Right. So let me answer that one first. There are countries that are climate stressed, and I live in one of them, technically, Singapore, that is wealthy and can buy itself out, right? Because much of the island is reclaimed. It's not porous sediment the way some of the places that are more severely affected by rising sea levels are going to be. The UAE is another country that's obviously coastal, getting very hot, but they can air condition their way, out of the problem, which is exactly what they're doing, building like air-conditioned domes. There are even poorer societies that will go back. I enjoyed kind of looking at kind of some of our, you may call it ancient cultural practices, like communal bathhouses and other kinds of things that certain countries are going to have to return to conserve water and so forth. So that will actually have cultural, implications that may not all be bad. But yes, wealthy countries, again, more or less can buy their way out of most of the situation. Or if they have very small populations like Qatar, right, it's not difficult to. But then the question is, will people want to stay in that kind of environment? It's a much bigger problem to have too little water than too much water, right? As tragic as floods are, you don't want to have no water. The thing about Singapore, which is not, I can't ex post sort of, rationalize moving there from London, as it were, because they are going to have a lot of water. London is certainly going to have a lot of water too, more than you want, unfortunately. You can, for an explanation of that, see Sir David King's from Cambridge University's report around the impact of climate change on the southern UK and scenarios for this city of London, in fact. But freshwater availability is abundant in Singapore. It's for us personally, when you think about the demographics of Asia, how dynamic, how thriving it is, to be in a place that's so connected to all of that was really exhilarating, and remains so. That you can just get on a plane and go to lunch in Manila or Jakarta or Hong Kong even, is really something special. So again, the demographics of Asia are really alluring, but Singapore in particular is, of course, a safe, neutral space. I call it, as Nigel and I were discussing a while ago, the de facto capital of Asia. Others say it's the London of Asia, whatever superlative, whatever kind of moniker you want to put on it. But it is definitely a great place to raise children, right? Very, very safe. Basically the safest country in the world, because even Japan has had terrorist attacks and crime, but those things, for a wide variety of reasons that I don't have time to go into, don't really happen in Singapore. I think, so it's been a great experience living there, but as you know very well, we're also quite mobile, and we think of it as much as a home, but also as a base.
Thank you. Well, I've been a terrible chairman. I'm afraid there's lots more questions which we haven't managed to get to. Oh. So apologies for those who sent them in or have got unanswered questions sitting in the audience. Next week, you may be able to raise some of these questions, in fact. So next week's Monday night lecture will be Professor Mariana Mazzucato, speaking to the title, Directing Economic Growth, a Mission-Oriented Approach. This lecture will make the case for rethinking the role of government in the economy, drawing on Professor Mazzucato's recent widely acclaimed book, Mission Economy, a moonshot guide to changing capitalism. So remember that the bar is open, remember that the bookshop is still open, and I think your book is there. So thank you again, Parag, for such a stimulating evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.